Evangelicals have had a wealth of resources available to them over the past 50 years on marriage, sex, and parenting. Books upon books upon books. Pastors, counselors, influencers, and lay people alike have tried their hand and have succeeded at selling tens of millions of how-to guides. Building a successful marriage, having lots of sex, raising up godly children. The only problem? They weren't any good. More than that, they were misleading, not based on any research, and harmful. They rode the wave of the 60s and 70s Christian publishing boom, many being far more concerned with sales volume and the conference circuit than they were with research-backed, biblically sound advice. The results of these books? Men have an insatiable sex drive, think about it 25 hours a day, and cannot seem to get. The results? Men have an insatiable sex drive, think about it 25 hours a day, and cannot seem to get a grip on it. Women sort of care about sex, but they needed to be available, prepare themselves for their husbands. They were more like outlets. And children? Nothing but devils in diapers on one end of the spectrum, or the glue that holds two people together. Given enough time to bake, these ideas presented a problem. Marriages suffer because the husbands don't feel respected and don't get enough sex. Women don't feel loved, and children keep leaving the faith. Enter the dominionists, those who need to fill the earth and multiply their seed. They got to populate the world with more Christians, with happier marriages, and obedient children. If we're ever going to fix society's issues, we need to get rid of the baddies and fill the earth with the goodies, wherein families of 6+ kids is not just the norm, but the expectation. Wives check in with other wives to make sure the husbands are satisfied. And children walk on eggshells, terrified they aren't happy enough, obedient enough, Christian enough, or good enough. This new crop of marriage, sex, and parenting advice and advisors promise blessing upon your family and seed. They promise legacies. They promise an easy fix, not necessarily a fun fix. For new parents, this can be terribly enticing. A system. You follow these easy steps, and you're in a far more fulfilled marriage, better sex life, and have a clear guide for raising your kids. These work for a while because they shine the surface. Enforced obedience works as long as your kid lacks agency or independence. Obligation sex ceases being fulfilling, if it ever was in the first place. They are quick fixes. They paint over the cracks of the building instead of looking at the foundation. But there's one thing this advice is really good for: control. The harder you squeeze opposing poles of magnets together, the more they want to separate. So you better grip tight. Welcome to episode 15, How to Rule Your Wife and Kids, a pocket guide to patriarchal marriage and parenting and training grounds for abuse. In this episode, you'll hear from repeat guest Sheila Gregoire of Bare Marriage, author of The Great Sex Rescue and She Deserves Better, amongst many past and forthcoming titles. You'll also hear from Marissa Burt, co-author of the forthcoming book, In the Way They Should Go, How the Christian Parenting Empire Shaped the Generation of Evangelicals, and where we go from here. We'll talk about marriage, sex, and parenting. For as much as Doug and others write on them, they sure don't understand them. Let's begin with Sheila Gregoire, who talks about the range of books and research on sex published over the past few decades.
There are a lot of studies on, like, for instance, what leads to orgasm in women, why women, what things in a relationship will make her pleasure more likely. All of those studies have been available. I think we're the first ones to look really, really large scale to see what's actually happening in evangelical marriages in the bedroom. And honestly, like, what we found over and over again is that the messaging that we are giving about sex that prioritizes men actually lowers women's orgasm rates, lowers women's libido, increases rates of sexual pain, but it also increases shame in men. Like, when you teach men, all men struggle with lust, it's every man's battle, and that what you need to deal with your lust is a wife, a lawful sexual outlet, as Doug Wilson calls women, you're teaching men that they're helpless. This is something you're going to struggle with your entire life. You can never find freedom. This is just who you are. And as well, So in the secular world, okay, if a guy is going to prove his masculinity, what he's going to do is he's going to sleep with as many women as possible. The notches on the bedposts idea, right?
Yeah.
In the Christian world, we realize that's not okay. Hedonism is not okay. Using people for your own gratification is not okay. So how then do you brag about your masculinity if you're not supposed to be having sex with everyone? And one of the ways you do it is you prove that you lust. Because if I lust and if I'm super struggling with pornography and if the little 12-year-old girl with cleavage is a problem to me, then I am showing that how virile I am. Because as a man, what I am supposed to do is lust. And so, by talking lust up all the time, it's a way of signaling, hey, I'm really a man. But I think the other thing it does is it teaches 12, 13, 14-year-old boys that you're helpless. You are trapped, right? Because you're a 12, 13-year-old boy. You're starting to realize that the girls around you have breasts and you get aroused by that and you don't know what to do about it, right? And at the same time, you're hearing this message that that's a sin. I mean, all men do it, but that's a sin. And so you need to grow up and get married so that you'll have a lawful sexual outlet, right? What they don't tell you is that noticing that a woman is pretty is not a sin. Noticing that a woman is attractive is not a sin. Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman with lust, okay? So whoever deliberately looks with a deliberate mindset of lust is a sin. That is objectification. And that is what Doug Wilson teaches, that women are really only useful for serving you and for having sex. That is the definition of objectification. But I think that we have also locked a lot of men into a shame cycle where they feel like they have no actual ability to conquer this in their lives. Because if you even notice that a woman is attractive, you've sinned. And so we have to find a way to teach people to differentiate between objectifying and dehumanizing someone and using them for your own gratification, imagining them in some way, leering at them, thinking of them merely as body parts, or just treating them like a person. And there hasn't been a lot of teaching on how men can just treat women as people, even if those women are attractive.
Purity culture has been lauded as the way to keep men and women away from having sex. But its unintentional consequence has been to objectify women. While modesty can be good, it tends to treat women as a compilation of body parts and not as beings. When the consistent drumbeat in Wilson's camp and the broader evangelical world has been, women must help men shield their eyes and protect their hearts, women become dangerous. That is until they get married, and then they become outlets. I'll let Sheila explain further.
Yep. And I think that language that Wilson uses is so interesting because, she's supposed to be my outlet and it isn't working. But what you're doing by seeing women as an outlet is you are agreeing with pornography. Okay. One of the problems that we have in these kinds of circles is that we see women as a replacement for porn. So you don't want him to watch porn, don't want him to lust, or in Doug Wilson's case, don't want him to be a pedophile. All you need to do is give him a wife so that he can use her to get his climax, his ejaculation, whatever. Okay. So you're seeing her as a substitute for pornography. Porn and sex, godly sex, are not substitutes. They are polar opposites. Because what pornography says is, I want to use you for something. I want to use you in order to get something that I want. But sex, in the way that the Bible puts it, is something that is supposed to be a deep knowing. It's supposed to be a joining and intimacy. And those are so real sex is not a substitute for porn, and porn is certainly not a substitute for real sex. But if you see a woman or your wife as merely a sexual outlet, you are seeing her as pornographic. There are an awful lot of people who've been married for 20 years in Doug Wilson's church who have never had sex. All he has done is used her body. And that is not sex the way that God intended.
Let me be clear here. As far as I'm aware, Wilson does not call women outlets. He infers it. Women are men's way of curbing all sorts of sexual proclivities. he exchanges porn for his wife. Here's some audio from a YouTube clip from March of 2022 on All My Friends Are Heretics with Doug Wilson, who describes how the marriage bed provides a curb for pedophilia.
If Stephen finds a girl who wants to marry him, he wants to marry her, they want to get married, he's repentant, he's walked clean for years, he's been clean for years. I know that one of the aids and helps that God has given in this fallen world to guard against sexual immorality is lawful sexual relations. Right. He's attracted to her. He wants to be with her and so on. I could say, this is a good idea, but why don't you go to a justice of the peace? Well, that's just me being a coward of a pastor. If he's a member of my congregation and I routinely marry people who request from the congregation, and I can think a range of things about weddings that I perform. I could say I could be thinking anything like, this is the best thing that ever happened. I'm glad they found each other. To, I don't know,
But because you're not a cult leader.
Because I'm not a cult leader. I have a pastoral voice. I want to dignify, sanctify the proceedings, make it serious, make sure that the parties know that the church is interested in them keeping their vows, right? I don't want to outsource things like that.
Doug doesn't say it outright. He implies it. Steven Sittler's wife has replaced his pedophilia desires. Of course, that would be crass to say, but as Sheila suggested, to in any way imply sex with a woman curbs any other sexual desire is to use her in place of another object or website. She is an object you use, not a person you love. To get even deeper, marriage as a replacement or the fulfillment of these desires begins placing obligations on the woman in the relationship. Whenever he has need, she must be available. The man has a stronger sex drive, the woman a lower one, so she must be available and ready for whenever he needs it. She can sacrifice. Here, Sheila describes obligation sex. Interesting. So even a message from the pulpit or a message from youth group or whatever it is, somebody's saying the man's going to have a higher drive than you, you're just going to have to deal with it and be available for him. That message in itself will actually drive down a woman's libido.
Yeah, you know what else it does? And this one's really important. It is largely the reason for the outsized burden of sexual pain disorders that evangelical women face.
Yeah.
Okay, so here, everyone knows the term erectile dysfunction, right? We all know what that is. Yes, there's commercials for it, little blue pills. Very few people know the word vaginismus.
Yep.
Very few. But 23% of evangelical women have experienced it, according to our survey of 20,000 women for our book, The Great Sex Rescue. And we have a paper coming out in the Sociology of Religion Journal, in early 2025 to talk about this too. But 23%, that is huge, okay? Experience sexual pain. That's roughly 2.5 times the rate of the general population. They have known for 50 years in the gynecological literature that sexual pain is largely an evangelical or religious conservative problem. They just haven't known why. And we can tell you why. When you tell women that you are obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it, our bodies interpret that as trauma. Your chances of experiencing vaginismus increase to almost the same statistical effect as if you'd been abused. Because obligation and abuse both say to women, you don't matter. He has the right to use you however he wants.
The message does something to women. It actually lowers their libido. A vicious cycle occurs. The pastor preaches on sex and the obligation women have to men to fulfill their desires and keep him from porn or prostitutes. And the woman has even less desire for sexual intimacy. The more she's described as an object and an outlet, the less she desires it. And further down we go. The man as conqueror and the woman as conquered. The man who penetrates and the woman who receives. These are Wilson's ways of describing the woman as an outlet. driving her sex drive even further into the ground. My guess is if you're a woman listening to this, you understand, maybe for the first time, what's happening to you in these circles. If you're a man like me, listen up. I asked Sheila to further describe how exactly these messages affect a woman's libido and perpetuate this vicious cycle.
Okay, so 56% of marriages, men have the higher sex drive.
Okay.
19% she does, and in 23% it's shared. So there isn't anyone with necessarily a higher sex drive. So the idea that a man has sex in a way that a woman will not understand, I mean, maybe that's true for half, but barely half, but that's it. But here's what's really interesting. When you look at secular studies, you'll find that there's more parity. So women's sex drives and libidos tend to be higher in secular circles than they are in Christian circles. And we measured why. Okay, when you teach certain messages, women's libido artificially falls. So when you teach women, hey ladies, all men are going to struggle with lust. It's every man's battle. Her libido is going to fall. When you teach women that you're obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it, her libido is going to fall. And so is it that women have these really low libidos naturally, or is it that that is what we've done? And there's another study out of the University of Toronto from 2022 that found that a woman's sexual debut, whether or not she reaches orgasm, influences her libido long term. So if her first sexual debut is really good, she's going to enjoy sex. She's going to have a libido like throughout the rest of her life. But in Christian circles, women's sexual debut is way worse than in secular circles. The number of women who actually reach orgasm in the first sexual encounter, if they wait for marriage, is very, very low. It's like under 10%. And the majority of couples, she will bring him to orgasm before intercourse, before the first time they try, but he will not do the opposite for her, even though women are the ones who have a harder time reaching orgasm. So I think there's a lot of things that combine for women's low libido, but one of them is the way that we do the sexual debut, and we don't prioritize women at all.
I'll repeat what she said. Secular couples have closer sex drives to one another than evangelical couples do, because the women's are higher. These women aren't receiving the messages in secular culture that women in evangelical cultures do. When women watch a video from Doug, Nancy, Rachel, Rebecca, or anyone else in these circles about their obligation to their husband and submission to him, their drive lowers. Secular couples enjoy sex more than Christian couples. Don't listen to the garbage that being a Christian makes your sex life better. If anything, it makes it worse. Now, I'm not saying leave your faith for better sex. I am saying these messages do something to us biologically. If anything, the Bible wants us to have better sex, not worse. So, what do? How do our marriages get better? How do we close the gap on the libidos? How do Christians have better sex? I bet you didn't expect that from Sons of Patriarchy, but we're here to help.
Marriage book actually coming out in March, which is based on our matched pair survey. So we looked at what actually contributes to good marital satisfaction. So that's really fun. But I would say, when it comes to sex and marriage, it's and sex especially, it's just three things. Make it intimate, so you truly feel known, nobody feels used. Make it pleasurable for both. And make it totally mutual where this is something you both want. A lot of people see the main problem with sex that we have to fix is that women don't want it enough. Okay, so how are we going to fix the fact that women don't want it? Which is problematic when, you've got like 20% of women whose husbands don't want it. They never talk about that. But the main topic when it comes to sex with most of our books, with Doug Wilson, with all of them, is how do we get women to have more sex? And Doug Wilson just says you have to. But actually, let me tell you something.
Yep.
Desire and frequency is a symptom. It is not the problem. So I'm going to list 5 things for everyone, okay? So get ready. There's 5 things coming. When women feel emotionally close during sex, okay? So when there's no porn use in the marriage, when there's high marital satisfaction, so mental load is shared, they're able to talk about things, the conflict resolution is good. When she frequently reaches orgasm, and when there's no sexual dysfunction, frequency takes care of itself. So when people are bemoaning the fact that women don't want sex, that's the wrong approach. What we should be saying is, okay, what are those 5 things? What's happening? Is there porn use in the marriage? 50% of married evangelical men are currently using porn in some form. That's going to wreck intimacy. That's going to create a pornographic style of relating with your wife where you feel like you get to use her. Is she frequently reaching orgasm? We have a 47-point orgasm gap among evangelicals, which appears to be larger than in secular couples, where 95% of men almost always or always reach orgasm in a given sexual encounter, whereas the equivalent number for women is only 48. So that's a huge orgasm gap. Right? So like, why should she want something if it isn't even good for her? Or what if they're not feeling emotionally close? Like there's all kinds of reasons why she might not want sex. And we need to approach these things with curiosity about how we can build healthy desire and a healthy sex life in both people, as opposed to just guilt and shame and pressure and coercion.
This advice is incompatible with the patriarchal system. The patriarchal marriage and sex system is no egalitarian pleasure party, but a domination of the man over the woman. He rules, she submits, and the women wonder, probably never out loud, why don't I enjoy this? Have I ever enjoyed this? Does he care about me beyond how I mother our children or please him in bed? Where marriage counseling drives no deeper than, how's your sex life? What positions do you use? How often do you have sex? Are you pleasing him? Is she being submissive? Make sure you have enough sex. If the marriage is on the rocks, who's usually to blame? I'll give you the hint. It's not the man. So I asked Sheila to give counsel and advice to 4 groups. Couples who are struggling, wives who are at the verge, patriarchs who aren't convinced, and pastors who've messed up giving their own advice. We'll start with the couples.
Yeah, so this isn't going to get better until we start prioritizing what she wants as well. And that can be a really hard switch to make. But a lot of it is theological. I think what happens in the patriarchal system is that we teach that women, or that God saves women so that women can save men. I mean, think about the wording, right? That she is your lawful sexual outlet, that she has to be the gatekeeper to make sure that things don't go too far when you're dating. That she needs to let you use her body so that you don't lust. Basically, what we're saying is that men are helpless without women. That if she doesn't respect you properly, you're not going to be able to fulfill your role as a husband. That if she doesn't ask in a respectful way, that you're going to feel, emasculated, and you're not going to be able to treat her well. You have your own relationship with Jesus. She is not Jesus. She can't fix things. She can't make you a good person. She can't make you not lust. Like, guys, you were made in the image of God. You're not some lust monster, disgusting sin creature that needs to be tamed by a woman. You were made in the image of God. And the Holy Spirit is available to you to help you develop all the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are all available to you when you submit to the Holy Spirit. And so the reason that your marriage is hard, or that, it's not her fault if you can't control yourself. And things aren't going to get better until you take responsibility for your own stuff. And to the woman, I would say things aren't going to get better until you realize how much you matter. Until you realize that you aren't responsible for keeping him from sinning. You aren't responsible for keeping him in a good mood. You are not responsible for those things. You're only responsible for yourself, and you get to matter. And so you need to learn how to speak up and tell him what you want and tell him what you need. And grow a boundary where you say, I can't be treated this way anymore. And when you do something like that, I'm going to leave the room, I'm going to leave the house, I'm going to, whatever it might be. But we all need to take responsibility for each other. And too much of this whole system teaches us that the only way he can act kindly is if she does everything right. That's not true. This is not true.
Now we move on to the wives. Will it get better? How can it get better? Let's ask.
I just want to say that God never said you don't matter. God said you matter infinitely. And the idea that someone gets to use your body, gets to literally go inside of you and use you and even hurt you, and that this somehow glorifies Jesus is so not of him. And I am so sorry that you have got that message that your husband using you is something that God wants, because it isn't. And I encourage you to go read 1 Corinthians 7 again, because often that's thrown at women, the do not deprive verses. Read it again and imagine yourself 2,000 years ago in the Roman culture. And you read that the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. And it's like, yeah, that's obvious. Sure. But then you read, likewise, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to the wife. In Roman times, the man owned his wife. He could kill her if he wanted. And so when Paul wrote that first bit, the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband, everyone's like, yeah, whatever. But when he wrote that second bit, that in the same way, his body belongs to her, that was revolutionary. That is the revolution that Jesus brought, is that you're not property anymore. Marriage is supposed to be totally mutual. Everything he gets, you get too. And this whole idea that you're not allowed to deprive your husband, what is it that you're not allowed to deprive him of? See, if sex is something where you feel distant from your husband, where you don't feel pleasure and where you feel used, you are already being deprived, and those verses don't even apply. Nobody can throw those verses at you if the sex that you do have makes you feel miserable and used. Because you're not allowed to be deprived either. And what is it that God wants us not to deprive each other of? He doesn't want us to deprive each other of an intimate, mutual, pleasurable experience that makes you feel closer and that builds you up. If sex is something which is making you feel ugly and used and degraded and coerced, you are being deprived. And you do not have to consent to being used. And if it's not, if that is what is happening, please, please, please call a domestic violence hotline.
Maybe you're a man or woman who's not convinced. You've bought into the hard complementarian or patriarchal system. The man penetrates and the woman receives. Maybe you're the husband in one of these relationships and you scoff at the equality in these marriages with high sexual satisfaction for both parties. Or you're the wife who's convinced herself, contrary to the evidence, that you're doing okay, that your marriage is fine, that you're satisfied with your sex life, and that you aren't being used because this is the norm in your church. What advice would Sheila give you?
People often bemoan the idea of a sexless marriage, which researchers often define as having sex 10 times a year or less. So sexless marriages are bad. They're sin. You're not allowed to say no, right? But there is an equal number of what we call sexless marriages in disguise as sexless marriages in our survey of 20,000 women. So sexless marriage in disguise is sex where a woman doesn't reach orgasm and feels emotionally distant during sex. So for her, marriage would be better with no sex, because when we have sex, she feels worse. So sex is not something which makes her feel better. Sex makes her not like her marriage more. And the more that happens, women can put up with this for a certain amount of time. Okay, we measured this. There's something called what we like to call the unfairness threshold in our new marriage book. But you can put up with that for like a couple of years, maybe even a decade, maybe even 15 years. But after that, the marriage will become sexless. She cannot put up with that forever. And most women will eventually stop having sex because they are so traumatized. They feel so used and they're so done. And if you are just using her as a masturbatory aid and you get some sort of thrill out of doing that, that is not of God. That is disgusting. Because she is not a body to use. She is a woman you're supposed to be loving. And if sex does nothing for her If the only purpose of sex is to get your needs met, so to speak, you're not actually meeting your needs, because your real need is not for ejaculation. Your real need is for connection and intimacy. And you are replacing that real need with something else. And why would you want to do that? That's a counterfeit. When God gives you the opportunity to truly love and serve each other and build a marriage and sex life, which is fulfilling for both of you, why would you not want to do that? But the more you use her, the more you make that kind of fun sex life that she might actually want, the more you make that out of reach. Because the longer you just use her, the more you teach her body, this isn't for me.
Finally, to pastors. You've talked about sex, it just hasn't landed. Maybe it's even been harmful. What should you do?
You know, anytime you joke about how much a husband needs sex, you are normalizing the idea that all men struggle with lust and that sex is for men and not women. You're normalizing the idea that women won't have a libido. And you got to stop it. Let's normalize sex being an egalitarian pleasure party. Let's normalize sex being something which is great for both people, which means we can't joke about how much women don't like it and how much women need it. We need to talk about how good sex is. And when it comes to marriage, I would say this. I think this is important. The majority of people who preach that men need to make the final decisions do not practice that in their marriage. Okay, 78.9% of couples, according to our survey of 20,000 mostly evangelical people, women, make decisions together. As soon as the husband makes the final decision, even if he consults with his wife first, the divorce rate increases by 7.4 times. And it's not just us who found that. John Gottman, who's the world's premier marriage researcher, found a divorce rate of 81% when men make the final decision and don't share power with their wives. So the whole philosophy that is coming out of Wilson's church is something which, if practiced, hurts people. But again, let me stress, most people who preach this and believe it don't practice it. So if you are a pastor who loves his wife and who has a great relationship with his wife and would never dream of like making a unilateral decision, stop preaching that men are supposed to be in power and start preaching what you practice. I just want people to preach what they practice. Okay? When you have a wonderful, loving marriage, preach that. Rather than all of this stuff about how it's so important for men to have authority over women and for men to dominate in patriarchy. It doesn't work. It hurts people. Maybe it hasn't hurt your marriage, but what if your daughter marries someone who actually puts that into practice and dominates her? What if your sister marries someone like Doug Wilson? What's going to happen then? And so preach what works. Preach what you practice if you practice mutuality, because we know that results in so much better marriages, so much better sex lives, less sexual pain, more orgasms, longer, happier marriages. It's great.
Yeah.
And so why don't we preach what actually works? I wrote stuff for a long time that I realized was wrong. When we did our research, when we started our research project back in 2019, and I looked at the initial survey results, I realized, oh crap, I've got to take down a ton of blog posts because I was spreading the obligation sex message. And I called my publisher Zondervan and I said, can I please rewrite The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex? Because I can't stand behind it anymore. Not after looking at the research. And I talked to another publisher and I asked for some of my earliest books to be taken out of print. And I just want to say, it is okay to say, hey, I've grown, I've learned. I was wrong back then, but this is what is right now. It's called integrity. It's like, it's what Jesus calls us to. And you don't have to always be perfect. It's okay to grow, and it's okay to say, hey, I said some stuff wrong. I'm really sorry about that, but here's what I know now is right.
Before we move on to Marissa on parenting and discipline, I asked Sheila for any final thoughts she might have for you who are listening.
Again, I think it just comes back to the fact that women matter. And a lot of people that I talk to who are in these groups, they're like, well, I'm just following the Bible. And how can you tell me that following the Bible is wrong?
Yeah.
And I would just say, no, you're following your interpretation of the Bible. Don't equate your interpretation of the Bible with the Bible itself. And Jesus doesn't delight in causing suffering to his daughters. Jesus doesn't delight when women submit to suffering. Jesus doesn't say, yes, this is amazing, she's suffering. No, Jesus delights when two people learn to serve one another, and when two people learn to love one another and submit to one another and just follow after him. And even if it works for you, I would just say, are you really sure it does? Are you sure it does? Because can I tell you something called the rose-colored glasses phenomenon?
Please do.
Okay. When people grow up or live in a subculture where marriage is called the ultimate for women, like this is women's ultimate identity and calling, they are more likely to say that they like their marriages and really and like their sex lives, even when objectively they're not that great. So women who are super conservative, like women who believe in male hierarchy, they are 33% more likely to rate their marriages as really good. Okay, as like the top tier. They're also 35% more likely on the individual measures of marital satisfaction to rate them in the bottom tier. So they say their marriages are great, but then when you say to them, do you feel heard during an argument? They'll say no. Does your husband take your opinions into consideration? No. So they'll say their marriage is great, but when you actually drill down, they rate a lot lower than women who believe in mutuality. Similarly, when we look at sex lives, you know, when you look only at women who don't reach orgasm, okay? When you ask women who are in these circles where they believe in male hierarchy, are you satisfied with the amount you orgasm? And remember, these are women who never do. They are 22% more likely to say, yes, I am, than women who don't believe in male hierarchy. So we've just taught women you don't matter. And so just because you think your marriage is great doesn't necessarily mean that it is as good as the people who actually practice intimacy and mutuality. Because you're in a system that has been told your whole life, this is your identity. And that's a hard thing to get rid of. But if you were to honestly ask yourself, do I feel heard? Am I important? Do my opinions count? Do I feel like my husband shares his heart with me? Am I able to share my heart with my husband? Do I feel safe? You know, those questions matter to Jesus, and they're allowed to matter to you too.
Next, I talked to Marissa Burt. She's a novelist who's trying her hand at writing a book on parenting and discipline, the different approaches to parenting evangelicals have championed over the past few decades, and the use of corporal punishment, which she'll define in a bit. Let's get to know Marissa.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter. My name is Marissa Burt, and for the past couple of years, I have been researching the history, the content, and the impact of popular Christian parenting teaching. And along with my co-author, Kelsey Kramer McGinnis, I've written a book called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. And that is coming out from Brazos Press this fall of 2025.
And what we're doing in the book is kind of tracing the historical development and underlying theological assumptions that have shaped popular Christian parenting teaching really from the 1970s to the present. And also looking at different topics and themes that come up in them, including like expectations for instant obedience, the use of corporal punishment and discipline, how sin shows up in these teachings, that sort of thing. And exploring that, hearing from people, interviewing people, how that impacted them, both older generation of parents as well as children, adult children raised in those environments. And so this intersects with my interests. I have a master's in theology. I studied the sociology of religion in undergraduate. studies. So these sort of the way these things combine, the way theology plays into practical application, particularly in family life, is of interest to me, especially as I'm a parent to 6 children. I'm a pastor's wife, so see how this plays out in the pews and in parishioners' lives. So all of those things kind of come together to make this of interest to me.
I then asked Marissa to talk about her interest in and knowledge of Doug Wilson and his influence in the parenting and discipline space.
Well, I think Doug Wilson and his community, so many people are introduced to his teaching via family life resources, whether that's through homeschooling. I think especially 10, 20 years ago, it would have been largely through homeschooling communities where, kind of resources passed around. But currently through all their streaming services, their platforms, they really have aimed at that. They've written books. Standing on the Promises is a parenting book they have. They've got one for women. They've got Federal Husband, I think, for men, and they've got Praise Her in the Gates for women. They've got a Why Do Children Matter? I think Why Children Matter for children. So this is really a staple of their teaching. It's a lot, I think, of the demographic they draw is young parents, people with children. So it's also, I think it's a moneymaker, right? This is not a surprise in Christian publishing in general, Christian publishing and self-help, but certainly for a platform like Canon Press, they've got reams, so much streaming material that's family life teaching oriented. And it makes sense, right? Like when people become new parents, that can be overwhelming. They want help. They want advice. If they're devout, they want to know how to please the Lord and obey the Lord. If they're new converts, they want to know, how do I do this differently now that I'm a Christian? And the theological frameworks within Doug Wilson's perspective regarding generational faithfulness and a legacy really play into this. There are very specific ways that you do this, that you can achieve promises that will guarantee your legacy. And I'm here to make those promises and tell you how to do them. And discipline is a huge part of that. In fact, he says, spanking is a way to please the Lord, that if you don't discipline your children, you're hating them. And specifically with spanking, he has four key things that he says about the quote right way to spank children. You don't do it in anger. You what does he say? I jotted them down. It must be painful. There needs to be a time of instruction, and afterwards there should be a full restoration to fellowship. So children can't, he calls it pout or sulk. They need to kind of come back to the family life. And that's how you've done it right. So he can get quite prescriptive with it. And also he's gone viral a couple times, and within his books, he's very frank about how this needs to be a deterrent, a painful deterrent. He calls what he utilized with his children periodic, quote, reigns of terror, where they would spank for every infraction to kind of reestablish authority. The idea being, if you spank really frequently when children are very young, you will maybe have to do that less. So it's very much a piece of it. It's very normalized. I know on Twitter, Toby Sumter has spoken about how even within the church, there's a designated space for spanking. So I think the community, this is very normalized within the community as well. I think it would be the anomaly that anyone would resist this kind of teaching.
It's hard to get around it. The funnel to all things Doug Wilson is the homeschooling movement. Doug and Nancy began writing during a time of massive cultural upheaval, so many families were looking for help. How do I parent my child in this turbulent age? With the woke encroach, we got to know how to parent to make sure our kids aren't infected. At its most foundational level, what is the dominionist approach to parenting? Marissa explains.
It's not true to real life, and it's not true to the gospel.
No, not true at all to the gospel. No.
It also, so I was speaking with someone today who was expressing how they knew if they articulated even doubts they were having about their faith, it would be a loss of parental love, right? There was no space for any, and a lot of times there's just no space for humanity, right? The standard of perfection, the standard of the mold is so high, there's no space to have an emotion, right? Especially in the Doug Wilson corner of Christianity, there's no space. Like, you have to have a happy heart, you have to choose it. There's an anecdote of, I think it's Rachel with her young toddler son, where she tells him no and he's upset, and she says, fix your heart. And he fixes, and she asks him, like, how are you going to fix your heart? And he's like, smile. And she's like, yeah. So there's really this sense of like, yeah, that's how you do it. You choose joy and you white knuckle it through. And I think when it doesn't work out, you're blamed, then you're heaped with shame. And I think also it teaches the spanking element in particular. When I hear people talking about the negative ways it's impacted them, some adults will name almost a compulsive need to feel pain, to feel things being right. So if something goes wrong, so maybe it leads to patterns of self-harm, or so it's wrapped up that they can't feel a sense of well-being, especially if they make a mistake, unless they experience pain. And then I also hear from people who then, within this framework, if something happens in their life, a tragedy, a loss, something sorrowful, grief, bereavement, they automatically think, what did I do wrong? This must be punishment. So it really takes people to some very distorted understandings of sorrow and suffering solely in terms of punishment, and a sense of reconciliation or things being made right must always be painful. So there are some hidden stowaway messages that I think it's apt that families are trained in this, but I don't think that's in the way people meant. Like, yeah, if you practice this day in and day out, it's going to form your spirituality. It's going to catechize you. It's going to train you in different ways. It's going to train your body in different ways. But I don't think that's what the parenting experts meant by any means.
No. Here's an example of what Marissa is talking about from a few years back on the Canon Press YouTube channel.
Rachel was visiting a friend. She's probably 3 or 4 in that before school age. And our neighbor had little kids, and so we would trade back and forth. So I went over to pick her up, and when I walked in, she said, "Oh, is it time to go?" So I thought, perfect opportunity. I got her home. I didn't address it there. But I did give her spanking. It's true. I did. But I just said, when I come in, you're going to say, "Hi, Mom." You know, that's how we do this. So the next time she went over there, I did the review. Now remember, when I come, you're going to say, "Hi, Mom." You're not going to say, "Oh, I didn't want to go." So it was beautiful, because then when I picked her up, it was just all that, yes, Mom is here at last. Yeah, but it's just that training.
You see, this parenting style, punishment and obedience, isn't only directed at bad behavior, but at subpar behavior. It's not just correcting what a child has done wrong, but about controlling the child's behavior. It's all about coercing or forcing the child to have a happy countenance, a smiling disposition, parenting that disciplines until the child is happy. This happiness, then, isn't that which flows from a wellspring of safety and security, of love for and from the parents, but of fear. If I'm not happy, I'll get punished. The child's behavior is monitored, tweaked through punishment until it satisfies the parent. Why would a parent parent their child like this? This kind of parenting doesn't develop in a vacuum. As always, like we talked about at the very beginning, this kind of parenting is a reaction. Whether to a real or perceived threat, it's a reaction nonetheless. Marissa continues about soft culture and hard parenting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. One, like, you can't have it both ways. Like, you can't say we've always done this way and we have a soft culture. Like, if this is the way it's been done, it's caused the soft culture you believe you're seeing. You know, like, you can go back to the 1800s and find people being like, kids need more punishment. Like, parents are too soft on their kids. So you go back to Dobson, and he's saying the parents in the 50s were too soft. Now you have people today saying parents in the 90s were too soft. So generationally, people are always going to say this. So I think you kind of can't say both this is the way it's always done and worked, and say it's not working. We don't like the outcome of it that we're currently living. But I also feel like for the Christian, that's a really pragmatic argument. Like, I don't think it's substantiable. Like, you can't really pinpoint spanking as the root of any of this. But I don't think the question for the Christian is what will work to achieve the end goals we want, particularly when you're talking about children, the most vulnerable people entrusted to our care. There is a question of ethics, and there is a question of, we are called to not achieve goals about power and dominion and authority. We are called to follow the example and life of Jesus. And so I think that's always the hermeneutic and starting place for the Christian. And I don't think those things are contradictory. I think Jesus was strong, obviously. But the idea of, does dominating the will of another through force align with Christian teaching? Does people in leadership kind of like you lording their authority over those entrusting to their care align with the teaching of Jesus? And I would say it's diametrically opposed. And when we're talking about when we're talking about things like the compassion, the mercy, the grace we receive from God, it makes me think of the parable of the unforgiving servant a lot when I read this teaching, because if you'll remember that parable, there's a servant who owes so much, he can never repay. He goes to his master, who forgives his debt, and the servant is overjoyed and turns around and kind of demands repayment from the one under his authority who has so much less owed. And it feels like this, that we have a framework that really wants us to be able to say, we receive God's mercy, and it's not about legalism and right performance. And yet we turn around and expect instant, almost standards of perfect obedience from our children, or else we're swift to punish. And the punitive aspect wrapped up with discipline, I feel like is at odds. Not even, I don't want to say I feel like, because that'll, people won't listen to me when I say that. I contend that that's at odds with what we see in Christian teaching. And certainly once you look at the one anothering verses in the New Testament, how we're to live in Christian community, I think children are part of Christian community. We are to be forbearing with one another. We're to restore the one who sins gently. We're to be kind. We are to be tenderhearted. We are to be compassionate. And all of those things apply. So yeah, I think the obsession with being hard is much more about the surrounding culture. I don't see a difference there. That's the language of empire and dominance, which is not the example of Jesus. So
one of the outworkings of this kind of parenting is a desire to triumph, to win over their children. I've heard it said before, parenting is making sure your kids don't need you in the future. But here, parenting is about winning. It's about rebutting secular culture and their weakness through hard parenting and disciplined battles. Here's a clip from Doug Wilson about these battles.
How do you deal with the tantrum issues?
You have to start by realizing what a big deal that winning that battle is.
Sure.
This they will start sinning is in challenging your authority. So what you have to do is make sure that you win. You just have to win.
Why do you need to win these battles? Why does it seem like this is an important thing a parent has to do? What battle is being fought? Who is in this battle? The battle is between the parents and sin. The rebellious child and the parent who's trying to straighten him or her up. Because if the parent loses, sin wins. Marissa, more.
Yeah, absolutely. Sin shows up. I just wrote a chapter on sin in Christian parenting last week because it shows up all the time. Though in the resources themselves, it's often very poorly defined, if at all. There's almost we all know what we mean by sin. And so it becomes a catch-all. So everything, childish behavior, pretty much anything a parent doesn't like can be sin. It can be whining. It could be looking at your parent the wrong way. It could be, biting a nursing mother. All of these can fall under that category. And some of it's going to depend on the theological lens, right? Like groups that hold to total depravity are going to be much more likely to say, as Wilson, I think, quotes his father saying, that's a little sin bag in a diaper, right? Or Bodhi Bochum, I never can quite get his last name. Bauckham, thank you, who says vipers and diapers, right? So there are some who will kind of outrightly say total depravity, that means infants are little bundles of sin. Now, interestingly, when we think about historical theology, because I did a deep dive on that, when you go all the way back, not only have ideas about original sin developed over the centuries, but certainly theologians are kind of all over the place on how they're willing to talk about children and original sin. And some of that is because theologians, especially in the early centuries, are kind of all over the place as far as like, how does this all work? Is it body, soul, and spirit? Is it just body and soul? Like when does a person get a soul? Is that when God breathes into them? Is that when what we would say maybe modern day conception, they didn't have that concept of conception. So you kind of see all this development, but none of that deeply nuanced, not even nuanced isn't the right word, but just deeply, this conversation full of conjecture, theological conjecture, is included in Christian parenting resources. It's just, this is sin, children are sinning. So there's either total depravity, or there's this kind of idea that parents should operate in the role of the Holy Spirit and diagnose the sin in their children's heart. And you see this all the way back to Augustine. There's an anecdote where he's looking at, I think, two infants, one's nursing and the other sitting on his mother's lap. And he kind of ascribes jealousy to the one infant watching the other. So you see it early. You certainly see it in a lot of the resources, right? Ted Tripp does this a lot. He calls the six-year-olds like hypocrites and kind of addicted to attention and like needing the cross to slake their sin desires. I mean, it gets very like laden with motivation, assigning sin motivations to children. And that's really normalized in a lot of these resources. Like it's a parent's job to do that. And the worst motivations are going to be ascribed to children, and adult motivations are going to be ascribed to children, right? Because there's no respect typically for child development or curiosity about that. There really is a sense that they're all operating with adult sin categories. And I think you're right. Someone like Wilson's theology makes room for that. In fact, he talks about how every moral requirement, I think is what he said. Yeah. Children are required to attain the same moral requirements of adults. Everything which is morally objectionable in adults should be disciplined for in children.
Yep.
So I think his theological perspective basically has no sense that there may be developmental concerns. A lot of times it's all just wrapped up with disobedience, right? Because if the perception is a child's primary responsibility is to obey a parent, anything they do that is disobedience falls under the category of sin. So in that sense, the parent really is placed in a godlike role. And some of the parenting books are quite direct about this. Ted Tripp says this, you're an agent of God. I think Doug Wilson would probably agree with that fathers are acting in godlike roles in their children's lives. So
here's an outworking of that understanding of sin and parenting. First with Doug Wilson, who's talking about his father, and next, right after, from Doug's younger daughter, Rachel Jankovic.
I remember when I was a boy, and I remember where I was standing in the front yard when my father put his fist in my face. And my dad also, quoting him a lot, he calls little babies in their swaddling clothes, he calls them little bundles of sin.
Say your kids are squabbling. It's very easy to be like, that's their sin, that's their problem. It's not mine. So when you see your children in sin, You need to take responsibility for that. You need to say, Lord, this is my job, and I have dropped the ball because they are in sin.
There's so much to unpack here. Just as Marissa talked about, there's a blanket assumption that everything a child does wrong is sin. Vipers and diapers, they're called. Crying, sin. Fussiness, sin. Everything that is not obedience and docility, sin. Sin is used so much, you wonder what good the kid can do. The kid either performs for his or her mom or dad, rebels, or is so confused that things just get worse. The number one tool in the toolbox for Christian parents who are trying to keep the sin of their children at bay, spanking. Marissa explains.
First, it's worth saying that you can go all the way back to ancient Egypt and find archaeological records of like how to beat your child. So there's something to say, like, this has been a piece of a variety of human societies for millennia. And some of this has to do with just commitments to violence in a worldview, control, or seeing children as lesser human beings. So there's some of that just going on. It becomes, I would say the distinction in Christian teaching is when it comes with spiritual authority and spiritual messaging. Because I would say those other realms of discipline, it's really about controlling behavior, and people are quite frank about that, right? The idea is you hit your child to get them to do what you want. But when you start seeing it, and even because I would pinpoint Dr. James Dobson as the beginning of a separate sphere of Christian family life advice. Before that, like, you didn't even have a ton of parenting experts. You would have a few, like Dr. Spock, maybe a pediatrician giving advice. But with Dobson, you begin to see a whole ecosystem that's specifically Christian parenting advice, diverging from maybe other cultural mainstream, and skeptical of it, right? Skeptical of psychology, skeptical of child development, stuff like that. So I would say before that, you kind of have not a lot of thought being given to it. And after that, you have a subculture of Christian parenting experts, often self-platformed and self-credentialed. Sometimes they're pastors. Usually they're just parents themselves. Often they're writing when they have very young children, but not really with any particular credentials to speak into child development or how children learn or anything like that. Making claims solely based on a hermeneutical understanding about, like, the Proverbs that talk about the rod. I mean, it really is kind of that flimsy, but it comes with this spiritual weight and spiritual authority of God requires this of you. If you don't do it, your children won't turn out well. Also, it's wrapped up with theological doctrines about atonement and substitutionary atonement. So it all of a sudden comes with eternal stakes. And I think, weirdly, Christian parenting experts kind of want to back off from the behaviorism. Like Dobson, when he first starts writing about this, he does take a behavioristic approach. When in 1970, I think, he publishes Dare to Discipline. When you read it, he talks about spanking, but in very much a like training a dog kind of way. It's very matter of fact. By the time you get to like the 1990s with Shepherding a Child's Heart and Ted Tripp, it comes in with a flavor of zeal. This is all about diagnosing the sin in your child's heart, dealing with the sin, bringing your child to the cross of Christ, reconciling with your. It comes with this like catechesis. And I think you see a mishmash of that in Doug Wilson's teaching, where he has got the behaviorism. He's very clear. Like, he, in fact, one says, you're bigger than they are. If what they're doing is wrong, make them stop. So he just is very much like, you are bigger. You can control your child's behavior through physical threat, through physical force. But he also includes the kind of catechesis as well. Like, you need to offer biblical instruction in this moment. You need to pray with your child. And so it's kind of wrapped up together. And I think that is distinct from what we see in broader culture. And I think this is also why Christian parents become resistant to questioning spanking. Like, I think in many European countries, spanking children is illegal. even in the US, there's a large body of research pointing out the harms of corporal punishment. There's kind of a consensus around that, even though I suspect the majority of American families still rely on corporal punishment to some extent. The kind of broader community is able to identify the harms and problems. But I think because Christian parents continue to believe there's a, quote, right way to spank that's particularly Christian and godly, that will kind of protect them and their children from any of these claimed harms. So there's a little bit of a pivot there. That's where I note it. And you do get kind of a spectrum, because you have people who, I think a lot of maybe mainstream evangelical families would be like, yeah, we don't like spanking. We don't really want to do it. But if things get really bad, we'll do that. All the way down to people like Wilson, who are saying, no, this is an essential ingredient. You must do this. And there's a very prescriptive way to do it. So you kind of can see a range of it. But there's I would say current Christian parenting people either just try and dodge it. They don't discuss spanking at all, or they will double down on one side or the other. Like, just join any Christian parenting Facebook group and you see a post on it, and it will light up. It will just light up like crazy.
You could say spanking is a quick fix. It administers quick justice that aids in more immediate compliance of the child. But this can and will backfire, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. For the Wilsons and others who practice corporal punishment on their children, there are two results. The child complies or the child doesn't. If the child complies, mission accomplished. Spanking did the job. The kid is obedience. But what if the spanking doesn't work? It may mean more severe punishment, more spanking, or far more dire consequences. You'll hear story after story during the second half of the series on failed spanking when it didn't work. So when Nancy's spanking didn't prove fruitful, when it didn't result in the obedience of her son, ND, what did she have to do? Nancy explains.
Then he got up again, and so swats. And then I put him back down. It's like, you need to stay in bed. Got up again. Swats. How many times?
4 or 5.
4 or 5 times. So each time I'm probably giving him maybe 5 swats. I may have moved up to 10 at the end. But I called Doug finally, and I said, so I put him back down. This is happening 4 or 5 times. What do you suggest I do next? Because I have to win. He said, I will be right home. I wasn't expecting that, nor was Nate. We won.
She called in Doug. The reinforcements. She won. What an odd thing to say between a parent and a child. But it makes sense, because discipline is a battle between a parent and his or her child's sin. The punishment works when the sin stops, when the child stops crying, when the child's disposition doesn't measure up to what the mom or dad expects. This child doesn't just fear being bad, the child fears being not enough. The child begins performing for their parents. The child does whatever he or she needs to do to stay in their parents' good graces. Because if the child doesn't stop, the punishment gets harsher, the parenting stricter, and the consequences greater. Here's Nancy and Doug talking about their swatting.
But I remember this was a turning point. He was just about on the edge of outgrowing his nap, so I put him down for his nap. He came out. It was like, no, you need to stay in bed, and if you get up again, there will be swats. So he gets up again. The swats happen.
And she knows how to deliver them.
Well,
we used to talk about getting a holster made.
I've already alluded to it. Now I want to focus on it. What happens with this kind of parenting doesn't work. When spanking doesn't produce the results in the child the parents are looking for. When the child rebels. Spanking day after day, week after week, month after month, but the behavior continues to persist. In fact, it grows worse. The parents are forced to confront a question they thought they could bypass. This isn't working. Marissa confronts this question. What happens when it doesn't work?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I think these frameworks really leave parents ill-equipped to navigate that moment, because they've trained parents as well, right? Like in all this, like, quote, training going on to train children to instantly obey. The parents have trained themselves to disconnect from their child in a moment of pain, to not listen to their child's experience, to expect compliance, in fact, to name their child's motivation, and to punish anything that the parent doesn't like. So parents have catechized themselves into that, such that when an adult child, when it doesn't work, or when an adult child comes to them and says, this was painful, or I see this in a different way, or takes an action that the parent perceives as rebelling or disobeying, they have no tools. They have no ability to listen or reflect, or are very impaired. I don't want to speak in such sweeping statements, but they're very unskilled and left really ill-equipped for that moment. And it's very unmooring. It's very scary because they've believed it's their job to act like God and control everything. And then they can't control another human being. And so, they will either blame the child, adult, young adult, child, whatever age, and say, well, that child wants to sin or is apostate, or that child is the problem. Sometimes they may blame themselves, or the community may blame them, like, you did it wrong, right? Like, the methods can't be wrong, the aspiration can't be wrong, so you did it wrong. And there can be a lot of shame surrounding that, especially in communities that place a high value on well-behaved families. Like even I think the Duggar family is a good example of this, right? Like, there's a whole ministry around this. And then when it implodes in whatever fashion, there's extra shame because what happened? Like, we were so zealous, we were so sincere. And so there's a lot of shame for the people involved. And there's often estrangement. I think the price of a young adult's autonomy is often estrangement for parents who cannot see their child as a separate person with agency to make different decisions. Either the child has to comply exactly what the parent does, or there's no space for relationship, or there's really inauthentic and impaired relationships. So maybe the child feels like they can't relate authentically with their parents, so they hide, or they don't disclose parts of their lives, and the parent is operating with a caricature. Sometimes it does become an invitation out for people. I do hear many hope-filled stories from people where parents did find capacity to listen, or it became a reckoning moment where parents began to see, older parents began to see that it hadn't worked and chose their child over the ideology. But I also hear from some who were unable to do that. So I think it's a really painful thing. I think there's a lot more of that going on than we maybe are aware of in churches of all denominations.
And people will hear a lot of those stories throughout the series too.
And very rarely are these people, the people who make the resources, held accountable for any of
no.
Like, they continue to profit, and some of these resources continue to circulate. Very rarely is anyone saying, you are the people encouraging people along. And I think especially with parenting teaching, because parents read it when their children are younger and move on, kind of. So.
But what happens when parents don't care? When the problem isn't on them, but their children? Their children are disobedient deviants. When it's not the system's problem, but their child's. Spanking in most cases grooms kids for abuse. I'm not saying spanking is abuse, but a certain mindset in these circles can certainly prepare kids to be unaware of abuse. When a parent is being physical with a child because he or she is not obeying, and when a parent is being physical with a child because he or she is not being pleasing enough, you open the door for an abuser who follows the same framework. An abuser who layers on a framework of, don't you love me? You'd do this for me if you did. Or, obedient children do this, disobedient children don't. So I asked Marissa to explain how spanking can unintentionally or intentionally groom kids for abuse later on in life.
Absolutely. And I don't know how someone would get hard data on this, just because abuse in general is so underreported for good reasons. In the sense of like people aren't believed and there's a lot of pushback and stuff like this. But absolutely, I hear from people all the time sharing their own stories, but it does not take much connecting dots to say when you tell a child an adult has permission to hit your body in private because God told them to.
Yeah, or you deserve it, or you're bad, and so this is your punishment.
Yeah, like, and this is how we are reconciled. And then to say, as Wilson does, you need to come out and act happy. We need to be reconciled. All of these are ingredients for being groomed for abuse and being groomed to keep quiet about it. And that second part, I think, is very specific to his explicit teaching. He says a couple places that like, nope, reconciliation means no pouting, no objection. You come out, you join the family with a smile on your face. And I think across the board, the kind of spanking, ritualized spanking, I think does enable abuse, not just from like maybe other spiritual authority figures and pastors who could use that terminology, but also has taught love means pain, like people hurt you because they love you. Wilson says this somewhere, discipline must be painful. God wants us to inflict pain on those we love. He talks about this. So I think that messaging sets people up for abusive marriages 100% because they believe, well, if my spouse is inflicting pain on me, that's a form of love. But then this third piece of like, oh, but once a person hurts you, once a person abuses your body, once a person inflicts this pain, no matter what you feel inside about it, you put on a smile and come join the community, is very sinister. And when it's paired with all the other teachings that come in a lot of high control communities about choose your own emotions, don't trust your intuition, the authority structure is godly, like your job is to submit to authority, even when they might be in the wrong, like God will reward you for submitting because that's your job, especially told to women. It teaches people to muffle their God-given defense mechanisms, their somatic responses, their emotions that would say, run, this is dangerous. They have been trained to not listen to those things. Or even if they're having like a panic attack response or an anger response or some of these like somatic responses that come when we've been mistreated, our bodies have been mistreated, they're taught those are sins and to dismiss them. So I think it's very it compounds what's already abusive in these very sinister ways that keeps people stuck and keeps people unable to name. I mean, so many times victims of abuse, especially in childhood, it takes decades before they can even name what has happened or have the vocabulary for what's happened. And I think all the more so when all of this religious terminology has been so embedded in the community. And this is something I think I sometimes want to really speak directly to the parents and be like, this is so short-sighted. Like you want your toddler to not throw a tantrum in the grocery store, but what you are doing day in and day out is teaching them it's okay for someone else to hit their body. It's okay, you know what I mean? To shut down any emotional response, to comply without question. Like that's actually what you're teaching them. And those long-term messagings, I think most parents would be horrified to think they don't want that for their child.
We've got a perfect example of this kind of abuse given to us by N.D. Wilson, Doug's son. Here's a clip from a November 2020 podcast episode, Being a Picky Eater. His daughter did not like the food she was given, and here's what N.D. did.
I had one daughter who would always like sit there with food in her mouth until she felt like throwing up. Ooh. And so she started to puke up a hamburger, started to tell this. I'm kind of sorry to tell this story, but she started to puke up a bite of hamburger. She managed to make herself gag. I successfully got my hand under her mouth, caught that bite, and then picked up her hamburger that she had just vomited on, took it to the sink, rinsed off the patty, and rinsed off the bite and set it back on her plate. I was like, even this doesn't get you out of it.
My guess is that didn't sound funny to you. Maybe you've been on the receiving end of something similar. When your parents do this to you, it's not a stretch to think this might prepare kids for abuse of other kinds from authority figures in their life. I asked Marissa about the kind of discipline that is expected at these kinds of churches, and how this might be a sign of the overall culture of discipline at the church. When spanking is required in these churches, or strongly encouraged, what does that mean for the culture of the church?
Yeah, I often will encourage people to examine the family life teaching of a church, because I think it can tell you a lot about how the individuals in the church will be treated. And this became clear to me as I began to listen to stories of abuse in church spaces and hear again and again survivors who would come forward. They would either not be believed, or even well-intentioned leadership would not have the capacity to listen or take responsibility in any fashion. And it would compound harm for survivors of abuse. And this sounded very familiar to what I was hearing from adult children who would be attempting to name what they had experienced to their parents. And there'd just be a lot of defensiveness and fragility, or we did the best we could, judge us by our intentions, not by the impact. There were just a lot of parallels. And in the same way that I think there's parallels in the ability to really honestly reckon with how much wrong has been done in the name of Christian authority and obedience, the flip of that is true. Like, the expectation for obedience of all of these systems that operate by hierarchy, right? There's father, and then mother, and then children. And I think when you parallel that hierarchy in the church, there's usually pastor, maybe it's like pastor and elders, but then it's like everybody else under that. And it's replicated, right? Like, the idea is that person is an agent of God, whether that's the parent standing in the role of God or the pastor standing in the role of God. They speak with the voice of God. They tell you what you're supposed to do to obey God. They judge the motivations of your heart and tell you maybe how you're sinning. And maybe they do this in, like, individually speaking, or maybe more broadly in, like, from the pulpit. This is the teaching. And if you fail to comply, the expectation is there will be church discipline, and that the church leadership are the ones in God-given authority to do that. And so again, there's no room for questioning. There's no room to see the autonomy and agency of the individual child or the individual parishioner. I sometimes call it functional narcissistic parenting, because I think there's a enmeshedness that means the child is always viewed as an extension of the parent. And I think the same things happen in these kind of church systems, where the parishioners are supposed to really be an extension of the authority figures and leaders. They're supposed to operate in whatever way the authority figure wants, to present the idealized family and the idealized image to the world. And sometimes it's for, like, spiritual goals, and sometimes it's just for power or personal benefit, or probably some mismatched combination of everything. But I think it's really worth noting, if you show up at a church and they're having sermons about spanking children, like, run, like, from the pulpit, not only for the sake of your children, but for your own well-being, because that's the same framework. Like, if you don't comply, you will be, quote unquote, spanked with church discipline. And often those are the churches that will have very detailed membership covenants and things like this to, like, get you to commit to submit to their authority. And in fact, a lot of these churches will also talk, and I hear about this all the time, because people will often leave me comments. People from these communities will leave comments on and they'll also be like, but God spanked me, or God spanks us, or whatever. And you have these weird distorted theologies that prop this up. So if you hear corporal punishment joked about, I think, if you hear it minimized, if you hear it normalized, I think that's a red flag for the health of a community. Wherever you land personally, I don't think corporal punishment is an option for the Christian parent. I know there are people who would still hold to it and say there are ways it can be done. Personally, I reject that. Wherever you land on that particular choice I would invite Christian parents to reconsider, but take that as a flag for the health of the community if this is like a identity marker for their community.
It's an important point to mull over. The kind of discipline that churches encourage families to dole out is the kind of discipline you should expect from the authorities at the church. Wives should expect it from their husbands, and you'll hear stories in this series about it. And children at the hands of church and school leaders. Left conspicuously absent from this kind of punishment, the husbands that get off scot-free because they administer it. Let's say we convinced you that corporal punishment, the patriarchal system of family government, doesn't work. More than doesn't work, it hurts. Not the kind of good hurts you experience after the gym, but that hurt that lingers, festers, seeps under the skin, and gets into your bones and won't let go. What do you do? Or let's say you're not convinced. We're just a bunch of progressive, woke DEI agents set on breaking up families and raising up disobedient children. Why should you listen or care? Because children matter. The next generation matters. This is true whether you're single or married, have 10 kids or none. Sex matters. It's not a transaction, nor dominated by one party. It is an egalitarian pleasure party. Both parties give fully of themselves, both in the bed and every moment before it. It's the consummation of a relationship, not just the cherry on top, not just to get the husband off the screen looking at others' bodies. I asked Marissa to give some counsel to those who are listening. If this isn't the way, what is?
Yeah, I would say I so get it. Like, it is a scary thing to be entrusted with children. You care about them. You care about their well-being. It is a lie and illusion that you have the capacity to control the outcome, no matter what method you choose. God himself has given his children free will to rebel. So you as a parent are 100% not going to be able to control the outcome and determine what your children will or will not do. So the question, and I think a lot of times it's wrapped up in fear. So I would invite parents they may be using the terminology of strength, but I think what's really underlying that is fear. And when you look at the different generations of parenting teaching, you will see fear as a motivator. You go back to Dobson, and it was fear of the hippie movement, drugs coming into the 70s and 80s. The societal fears creep into this teaching. So whatever the fear of the current moment is, I think it's worth naming that there's a fear that a parent has to control all these outcomes, which belies a lack of trust in the goodness of God to carry our children, to tend them, to be sufficient for them. So I would invite a reconsideration of that, to say, is that ours to own as parents? Like, are we to manage all the outcomes? Because that's not what I see in scripture. Certainly when you see so much of scripture is narrative, but you see everything all over the map. You see a lot of family dysfunction. You see godly people like Samuel, the judge, who have children who do not walk in the ways of the Lord. You see this all throughout the pattern of the kings, right? There's like there's no formula here. And in fact, you see in Jesus's parable of the prodigal son, like two children going in different directions, like one going in what people would say maybe is the wrong way and one doing it right. And in both, the father's response is not to attempt to control the behavior of the son, either son. The father's response is invitation to the son and invitation to connection. And I think we don't give parenting advice in our book. That's not the purpose of our book. But for this podcast, like, I'm a parent to speaking to other parents, I think it is wonderful to have an invitation to reconsider the paradigm and say, what if the point of parenting isn't behavioral performance and achieving that or exacting that? What if the point is an invitation to connection with our children, to love them as our neighbors, to demonstrate the love of God to them. Yes, to disciple and instruct and teach and correct. But if the goal isn't a robotic treadmill of obedience, but the goal is an invitation to maturity, a companionship as they mature, that is also comes with a trust in the goodness of God and the capacity of him to carry both parent and child. So I think it's a invitation to a different framework is the way out of that fear. But I think it's worth it to the parents listening. I think it's worth it because your alternative is this tighter and tighter control grip that doesn't work. I think all you have to do is listen. At this point, we have generations who have been raised by these very high control, even dominionist, if you're talking about Doug Wilson's principles, and it hasn't worked. You have more people. We have the great de-churching going on right now. And I think you have more people from the generations raised by these things exiting the faith altogether. So I think it's an invitation to reconsider.
Raising kids, it's hard. There's no right way to do it. There's no one way to do it. There's no blessing formula. There's no promise attached to a to-do list. There's no grade given to parents at the end of their lives. If the only reason your kids are obedient is because they're too afraid not to be, then they really aren't being obedient. Do they smile because you forced them or because they can't help but to smile? Do they obey because they respect you, cherish you, or love you? Or do they obey because they're afraid of the rod? You might scoff and say, as long as they obey, but I doubt you believe that. Why? Because it's not true of you. These things matter. Marriage is difficult. Parenting is difficult. Sex, yeah, that can be difficult too. But they're worth it. They're worth the work. They're worth the pain. They're worth difficult discussions and long nights. A simple solution, a spank, obligation sex, isn't even a quick fix. It's the Band-Aid on a cancer. It might look like it's healing, but you just can't see it. It's under the surface. A Band-Aid feigns that you tried. It only masks the problem. The problem isn't that you're not ruling enough, that you're not leading well enough, that you're not trying hard enough. The problem is that you aren't. Ruling, that's easy. Serving, that's a different story. Take it from me. It's easy to tell your wife what to do, when to get ready, when to service you. It's easy to spank your kids when they're being kids, when they're crying, or just not capable of putting up the disposition you desire. It's easy to look for easy solutions, quick solutions, solutions that just prolong the problem. But it's hard putting in the work, serving your spouse, getting to know him or her, of not just looking at the bed as when you're really together, but ending in the bed because you have been together. When instinct takes over, not responsibility. That takes time. Would you rather obligation or passion? To have your kids look at you not with fear, but with reverence. That's the kind of man or woman I want to be. They follow you because they want to, not because they have to. Because we follow not a Savior who ruled, but a Savior who served. A Savior who didn't dominate, but a Savior who was burdened. A Savior who didn't look at women to service him, but a Savior who looked at women he wanted to serve. A Savior who looked at kids and saw inheritors, not agitators. Life isn't about ruling, it's about serving. So it makes sense to mirror this in your marriage, your sex lives, and your parenting. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I want to thank both Sheila Gregoire and Marissa Burt for their time and expertise. Next up, we got a special episode, one that will transition us from the first half of the series to the second half. Stay tuned for Excursus, a conversation with Tia Levings on a well-trained wife. See you then. Sons of Patriarchy is brought to you by the administrators of Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow in partnership with Peter Bell. It's written, produced, and edited by Peter Bell. Original music, sound design, and mixing by Aaron Feeney. This series wouldn't be possible without the dozens of abuse survivors whose bravery and vulnerability make it what it is. Every episode was sent to them before being published, and their feedback, edits, encouragement, and eventual approval make this what it is. May your voices be heard far and wide. Thank you.